Thank you very much, Andrew. As we've been reminded throughout the day and also in Christian's presentation just now, this transition to sustainable PLFs is not, cannot happen in a vacuum, in a policy vacuum. And in the UK and EU and globally as well, there's so many shifts that need to happen, that need to take place to enable this transition, including in legislation and regulation. So in this final session, we will look at some of these aspects. Can really only touch on some of them, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Duncan Lugton, who is the Institute of Chemical Engineers Head of Policy, and who will talk us through his perspective on chemicals policy in 2024 and beyond. And Duncan's remarks will then be followed by an intervention from Tanya Sheridan, who's, sorry, Duncan, Head of Policy and Evidence here at the RSC, and she will talk about our own policy action and how this is related to the Sustainable PLFs agenda. And I'm conscious that it's been a very long day for you all, and this is the session is the final sprint before the canapes. So I'll just hand over to Duncan now, and Duncan and Tanya will talk back to back for about 20 minutes, and if there's some time left for discussion, that would be great. But yeah, Duncan, take it from here.
Okay, great. I'm conscious of times, I'm conscious of energy, so we're going to going to keep this high energy and deliver you safely to drinks at the end of the session. So what am I going to talk about today? So I'm talking about chemicals policy. This is just a quick outline. I'm not going to talk you through the outline, we're just going to do it. So Institution of Chemical Engineers does what it says on the tin. We're the qualifying body and learning society for chemical, biochemical and process engineers in the UK and worldwide. Over 31,000 members, and do all the things that you'd expect us to do. I'm not going to dwell on that. If you think you should be a member, you probably should sign up. So where are we now? Chemicals policy, it's a really complex and fragmented policy area. If you can remember back to this morning, we've had some really nice slides showing how this really sits across a number of different government departments, a number of different agendas are bound up with this. And what we've seen in recent years is really a lack of unifying strategic focus. And I was really pleased to see all the stuff on systems thinking earlier this morning, because there's a real need for systems thinking in this area, because chemicals run through and connect to so many different agendas that you need to be quite sophisticated in the way that you think about them. So the last time we had a chemical strategy in this country was back in 1999, and we were actually promised one back in 2018 by the previous government. They managed to avoid that by running out the clock, but there are still good reasons to want a chemical strategy. There are still good reasons to want something that brings together all the different strands of interests that run through chemicals, be that economic, national security, thinking about the environment, protection of consumers. So really, there's been a bit of a strategic vacuum in this area for a long time, and that's one of the big things to say about where we are at the moment, is that there's a little bit of a gap in the kind of policy space. And obviously, if you don't have some of that strategic structure and thinking in place, then it means that a lot of the stuff that sort of sits underneath that, or that would be determined by that strategy, then that's more difficult to do in a kind of joined up and systematic and satisfying way. So where are we now? Obviously today we've got lots of really clever and smart people together in a room who care about this agenda. Politics is a very topsy-turvy world. Sometimes it is less rational and data-driven than some of the conversations we've been having here today. And in the topsy-turvy world of politics, there's a lot of competition for attention and focus and interest. And even some things that are relatively high up the agenda, like net zero, there are ongoing conversations about the shape of those commitments, how they get discharged. So thinking about chemicals, thinking about PLFs, it's fighting for airtime and attention with lots of other agendas. So one thing that we're seeing at the moment is the haggling in advance of the budget, and that gives you an idea, if you like, of the sort of ferocity fighting for attention and for resource. So what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of the new government's agendas jostling for attention, and hopefully we'll get some sense of relative prioritization. To put it very bluntly, looking at departments, what money they've got to spend, what kind of ambitions they can have going forwards. Just in general, we know this stuff's difficult. It's difficult to do long-term thinking. If you're thinking about chemical strategy, if you're thinking about this policy area, you're having to think into the future, you're having to hit a bit of a moving target. There are lots of other agents involved, lots of other actors involved. But there are some reasons to be optimistic. So we know that chemicals policy connects to the government's missions and priorities, particularly in kickstarting economic growth. But there are also some potential links to the kind of aspirations around clean energy, potentially. So I think that there are reasons to have some optimism that the government should be thinking about this area. So looking forwards, which is the positive thing that we like to do, there's an opportunity at the moment. That's the way that I'd like to frame it. There's a new government in power. They're going to be in post for something like 4 or 5 years, depending on some of how the politics works out. And there's a lot of work being done at the moment to take ideas that were somewhat worked up during the kind of election campaign and put those into practice and work out some of those details and kind of align them with what resource there is available. So there's a lot of stuff being worked out all together, and that means that there's an opportunity to feed into lots of these other plans and to try and get thinking about chemicals built into some of those areas of thinking. So at the moment, we're expecting a new industrial strategy coming out very soon. Lots of the thinking about net zero and the actual plans to put that in practice are being worked out. Lots of the thinking about skills and consultations, thinking about the skills needed for the future, that's being worked out. Lots of other areas on, environment, public health, geopolitics, trade, research and development. There are lots of things that are being worked out at the moment. So now's quite a useful time to be thinking about feeding into the agenda. So a few things to highlight. Obviously, there's the big question of what's the future status with Europe and alignment in this policy area. And that's something that's very much going to have to be worked out by the government going forwards. It's obviously a very useful time to think about the possibility of a regulator in this space and what that would look like. The Royal Society of Chemistry has done some really useful work on this, kind of setting out what that might look like. And I think that would be a really positive step to kind of act as a bit of a focal point for lots of this thinking and activity. So, going to link this through to PLFs. So it's quite early on in the policy journey for PLFs. I think if you go to Hansard, the record of everything that's said in Parliament, you don't find a lot of mentions of PLFs. And I think that it's a topic area that's not really generated a huge amount of political attention yet. We've not had our sort of blue planet for PLFs or anything like that. They're not yet a household name. And I think one of the challenges for people interested in PLFs is trying to think how to get some of those politicians who are maybe juggling a large number of different agendas, how to get them to see the value of taking this subject area really seriously. So I think that there is an opportunity, though, for PLFs to be integrated into some of that broader thinking on chemicals, chemical strategy, and a really important role for organisations and the sort of people that we've got around the table here today to lead some of that thinking and to start raising awareness really amongst some of those decision makers so that PLFs can be built into thinking and planning across government really. So Very quickly, final slide, what would promote sustainable PLFs? Obviously, the big one is just throw some time and some effort and some thinking at it. That's always a good thing to ask for. National Chemicals Regulator could act as a really helpful coordinator for a lot of this activity and thinking. Support research into sustainable PLFs, so the government can obviously has some influence over the variety of funders, and it's really important that funders are prioritising some of the really practical end of the research, really looking at things like scale up, because there's going to be a lot of generic scale-up issues that rear their heads when it comes to PLFs and some of these really exciting new innovations. A lot of the generic issues that exciting new innovations run into are going to rear their head there for lots of the things we see here. So it's been really good to see that touched on earlier. Final couple of thoughts. Chemical strategy, I mentioned that before, just to be consistent. And finally, I think that the government's got an important role to play. It's not hugely glamorous, but through procurement practices. We've got things like the NHS, which is obviously a very big deal, what the NHS ends up buying. But there's also lots of other government departments that are significant economic agents that have a role to play in promoting the sorts of things that we want to see. And more broadly, you could look at other economic incentives, you can tax things, you can do all sorts of fun stuff, but I will leave that to another day. 5 seconds remaining, I'll hand over. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Duncan, for sprinting the sprint. Tanya, can I ask you to talk a little bit about what the RSC is up to in the policy space?
Certainly can. Thank you very much, Dan. And I know it's just me standing here between you and the wine, so I took the early decision to cut down my 105 slides to a slightly more manageable number. So RSC works on a range of policy topics. Our aim is to provide evidence from our community and elsewhere and to influence decision makers on the issues that matter most to the chemical sciences community and where chemistry has the most to contribute. And as you'll see, quite a few of those are pertinent to today's discussion and to PLFs, but I'm going to focus on 3 of them in the interests of relevance and time. So firstly, looking at the circular economy, we've been thinking about issues around e-waste, critical minerals and plastics for some time now. This was originally driven by the International Year of the Periodic Table and some really good thinking from some of the RSC science communities, namely Environment, Sustainability and Energy community and Materials Chemistry community, and built on through international scientific conferences. We use a range of different avenues for influencing in a science-informed way. We get scientists involved. You'll see there also Izzy, my colleague, giving evidence to a parliamentary committee on the importance of a joined-up strategy to tackle e-waste. And our basic angle here is that there needs to be an overarching material strategy for a range of materials, and that includes feedstocks, chemicals, and the critical materials that we all hear about. So here is a little link to that campaign. Please do check it out. Please do get involved and lend your voice to our call for a materials action plan. I think it's also relevant to PLFs in this context, in that we are looking for more sustainable feedstocks and for circularity. Now, Jen and Pete talked earlier about the importance of a range of different pathways to defossilise the chemical sector, including non-fossil energy inputs. And it's great to be in a room with companies that are pioneering a range of technologies to reuse CO2 or to recycle carbon. But I'll concentrate a little bit on some of the pathways around the non-fossil molecular carbon, as that is one of the key areas for sustainable PLFs. And I think what we want to see here is a bit more of a systems lens, and feedstock demand over time and across the entire economy is important. I think Jen alluded to that with the talk of a biomass target. But if we're going to go bio-based in our materials, have we actually got enough land to grow everything, particularly with commitments on sustainable aircraft fuel? And there's a very good article that Paul Monks, the Chief Scientific Advisor at Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, authored in Chemistry World a few months ago on that particular question. Moving on to workforce and skills, as a professional body, of course, we have a lot to say about this, and we provide insights not only to policymakers, but also use labour market information to give advice to our members on careers. And the last year we've been looking at the future chemistry skills. We've done some research on projections around the different chemistry sectors, and it shows that there's a potential of growth in chemistry jobs of 6.5% in the next, over a decade or so. That does assume that current trends project forward, which you can never assume, but it's probably one of the best data sources that we have. And that is quite significantly higher than the rest of the economy, where the growth expected is about 5%. And we've heard quite a bit today about the need for STEM skills and some of the challenges. And talking to employers and to heads of chemistry and to other educators, we are hearing that one of the skills challenges for chemists is around transferable skills. The labour market data from job postings bear out that both the transferable skills like leadership and communication and specialist chemistry knowledge are very important to succeed in chemistry jobs. And also that green and digital skills are growing areas. And again, we heard points similar to the one that Ashmita made earlier about the importance of skills to adapt to and make the most of new technologies. And that's something that employers are really looking for in the future chemistry workforce. So moving on to chemicals policy and regulation, and Duncan's actually summarised this really well for us, and it was great to see that one of the suggestions here for PLFs was indeed a national chemicals regulator, because we are campaigning for a national chemicals regulator which will ensure innovation and economic growth, that will maximise coordination against government, so that we get rid of some of the regulatory quirks that we've been talking about today and that we hear about from other sources. And it's much clearer, whether for inward investors or for SMEs trying to grow their business, what the regulatory framework looks like and where to go. But also in our interactions with the development or possible development of a chemical strategy over the last 6 years, we have been very clear about the importance both of protecting human health and the environment, and of making sure that that enables innovation and the flexibility and agility to adapt a regulatory framework to developing technologies. And so we've been catalysing debate with the case for the chemicals regulator, and very keen to keep talking about that with the Chemicals Agency. And then finally, we've also been working globally. Sorry, went too far with that slide. And we are an important voice in negotiations in the United Nations to establish a chemicals, waste and pollution prevention science policy panel, so something similar to the International Panel on Climate Change and the Biodiversity Panel, ICBES. I can see Camilla there at one of the meetings where we bring a scientific voice. We convene scientists globally, and last Friday we held the third Burlington Consensus meeting where we heard from a range of voices from across the world, across time zones, in a hybrid format, which really did showcase both the influence that the RSC has built in the process and the convening power that we are exercising there, but also just what a complex multi-stakeholder process it is and how important all of those voices are. And so we continue to work for that panel and that scientific voice, again, building on our approach of bringing science into policy and convening to bring scientists and policymakers together. And I think with the Burlington Consensus and the Science Policy Panel, that brings us full circle back to Annette's opening speech this morning, very much in the spirit of a circular economy. And I will just conclude by saying that with all this policy work, very interested to hear from you over the wine if you would like to get involved. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tanya, for doing another sprint there. I think that was very interesting, an overview. We have 2.5 minutes left. I was going to be very greedy and I had 3 questions that I wanted to ask Duncan and Tanya, but I think I might just skip that if there are any pressing questions in the audience. I'll wait.
Great, thanks. It is a question and it's a comment as well. As I was listening to the speakers there, I was struck by the lack of any link of this challenge to the UN SDGs. And I was guilty of that as well. In fact, I took a slide out about the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the context that Tanya presented of a science policy panel on chemicals, waste and pollution, it seems clear to me that that panel, if it operates in the same way as the 2 that already exist on biodiversity and climate change, will catalyse research, innovation and public perception, regulation, policy, all of those things in this space. So I think it's vital that PLFs are recognised in that context. So I guess it's a plea really to make sure things are linked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Tanya, do you want to, or Duncan, any follow-up on that?
Yes, so one of the important parts of the policy context for the work that we do is the Sustainable Development Goals, and I agree that the chemicals, waste and pollution prevention work does speak to goals 3, 6, 12 and 14, amongst others. You're now going to ask me if I can remember what they are. Well, test me over the wine, Matthew, test me over the wine. But it is part of the policy context, as indeed are other factors like the UK government's missions and the Scottish government's ambitions for just transition.
Yeah, just agree, and it's something that we situate our policy work within the context of the Institution of Chemical Engineers. You can find on our website some lovely kind of mapping of things against SDGs, and it's how we talk to a lot of the younger generations as well in a lot of our outreach. But yeah, just agreeing basically.
Any other questions? I think we have time for one more question before I then hand over to Andrew or Joe. Yeah, please.
I asked Duncan when he was sat down, but I think a lot of other people would be interested in the answer. What's the difference, or what do you view as the difference between a chemical strategy and the industrial strategy that we're anticipating from the government? And yeah, and how do you think that would work?
Yeah, that's a good question. In a sense, I don't care where the strategic thinking happens as long as it happens. there's a little bit of a path dependency question here in terms of there has been an anticipated chemical strategy. In theory, it is a cluster of work that will then continue to exist. So just in terms of like, what's a thing that is an agenda that's mobilized activity and some thinking's already gone on there, that's mostly why I've spoken about it. But obviously there is an industrial strategy that is coming out. If the industrial strategy covered all this stuff and thought about it, that would be great. There is potentially some areas that maybe wouldn't overlap or might be lost if it was approached purely from a kind of industrial strategy framing. There might be some of the more kind of environmental concerns might not get dealt with in the same way. But I think that I see the most important thing as the strategic thinking happening somewhere and making sure that the important things don't get missed off. I see it as kind of a political question where exactly that kind of lands in terms of government documents and strategies. And I think, you know, we'll just have to see how it plays out. But it's a good question.
I think the industrial strategy is likely to be thinking very much about priority sectors, inward investment, and that was the sort of hint, those were the sorts of flavours I picked up. I read the Skills England first report so that you don't have to, and it's also, I think, likely to build in elements of the science and technology framework, which I think was published in 2023 in February. I know that Patrick Vallance was very influential in that. So what does that mean for PLFs? What does that mean for chemicals? I think it means continue in the context of engineering biology. We heard earlier that that is something that Patrick Vallance is very much somebody who understands and really does see as a big technology. Chemical strategy, I think that's going to set the sort of framework within which chemicals regulation takes place, could potentially, although it's hard to read the signals on this, look at things like questions of whether there'll be greater alignment between UK and EU frameworks, and also look at the broader environment more for the use of chemicals and environmental impacts. But again, I think that is changing from under the last government. There does seem to be more of a drive for a cross-government approach, and I think potentially more of a big tent kind of a strategy if the Skills England plans are anything to go by. Does that answer the question?